First of all, tell the audience. I mean, I think my audience probably knows you pretty well. I retweet your stuff often. I'm a fan of your writing, and I don't say I say what I mean when I say what I mean. You have a very succinct style of writing. You cut to the point, and in maybe half of the words that most of us other writers use, you make some extremely salient points. And you did the same thing with your article on universal basic income. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then take us over into what made you write the article that you posted on Medium.
So I am a labor lawyer by training, but in my free time I study welfare states and inequality and poverty.
Hmm.
And as part of the free time hobbyist type stuff, which I've also been paid for, I guess, so it's not totally a hobby. I've become interested in universal basic income because that's one of the, I don't know, hip ways to reform the welfare state.
Right, right. Okay, and so you put pen to paper and you wrote this article, and the premise of the article is I haven't heard before, and it's actually a brilliant take, which is why I think the article is going as viral as it went. So the argument usually against a welfare state and universal basic income is always that giving people money will take away the incentive to actually do work, and it creates dependency, it creates laziness. But you flip that, you turn that on its head, and you use the example of people who are, the top 1%, if we want to call them that, who have the ability to live off of a set income that they don't have to work for. Many of them never worked for it. They inherited it and they just continue getting the residual income month after month. But we never look at that as a way of saying they're going to become lazy. We call them job creators, and we lift them and elevate them to this hallowed place in America. So conceptually, if handouts would make poor people lazy, why doesn't it make rich people who live off of basic income? Why doesn't it make them lazy? That premise is something I never heard. It turned it on its head. How did you come up with that, and unpack that a little bit for me?
Well, that's, maybe a couple hundred years ago, that would have been a very salient way to rouse workers in the factory or whatever, is to
Hmm.
say, hey, your boss doesn't work, and he lives much better than you live, and you work all day, every day. And so that's kind of been a long running critique of capitalism in some ways, is, if you build up enough wealth, you can live on it without doing anything. And so it's, just sort of playing with those concepts. It's a similar kind of critique,
Hmm.
really, with basic income. Is, well, if you give these people money detached from work, then that's really unfair. Everyone should be made to contribute and go out and do something, and won't they just be lazy, and so on and so on. It's actually the same kind of point. It's just we don't make the capital point anymore because, well,
Yeah.
socialism and communism and all
Yeah.
that. So
Yeah.
just pulling that into into the present and saying, hey, these arguments have been made before, and
Hmm.
basically we don't really believe them anymore about at least the rich. So
Right. Right. So yeah, actually, you make a great point there. Right. This is a pretty standard thought, but it is. I mean, it's been so buried, and I can't even say it's a standard thought because it's like it's brand new to us all over again. It's been so buried, and we never look at least not in our normal political discourse. Like our Overton window has not included a conversation about the laziness, right? The sense of entitlement that wealthy people have, that often many of them are passing down generational wealth that they never had to work for in the first place, right? So if we're going to have lazy people taking money from the government, are they going to be lazy rather because they take money from the government? Why don't we see the same phenomenon? Have you had any type of rebuttals as to why people living off of capital gains are not considered lazy versus poor people or average of people who would take universal basic income or welfare? Have you had any rebuttals as to why that is?
yeah, well, you've seen that there's a range of things people say in response. So one line of response is to focus on the fact that capital investment is important. So they are sort of doing something valuable in the sense that they're allowing their money to be involved in capital investment.
Hmm.
And so we shouldn't equate it exactly the same as workers, or excuse me, as people, on basic income who are getting UBI unrelated to capital that they own.
Hmm.
Um, that's one criticism. I don't find that a very interesting criticism, because my alternative is that you have the government own the capital, and so the money actually does come from capital
Yeah.
that we kind of collectively own, right?
Right.
We can say, hey, we all own a share in the National Wealth Fund or whatever, and then we're all like little mini capitalists, and then it should be fine, right?
Right.
The other move people make is to say that, in some ways we do criticize like trust funders. There is a kind of, stereotype we have of young trust funders who just go out and do drugs and party and that kind of thing. And that's true. That does exist to some degree, though. That, doesn't seem to actually be the norm of what people who inherit a lot of money
Hmm.
do. They actually seem to, they have the same advantages anyone else in that class does, and so they'll go
Right.
to good schools and get a good job, and for the most part. So I haven't seen a convincing criticism of it, really.
Because I mean, really, you put them in a between a rock and a hard place, right? So the first part is in terms of putting their capital, their money is out working for them. It still has a question of whether or not it's a sense of entitlement, whether or not it actually makes them lazy. All these justifications they have against arguments they have against rather UBI and again from our audience, UBI is universal basic income. It's a program essentially saying that you're going to have a basic level of subsistence met by the government, not just by the government, but by the collective body, right? It's not a handout per se from the government, but it's the American people that are putting that together and saying that we're going to have a base level of income. So the rejection of that based on the fact that it's going to make people lazy, it just doesn't mesh when you bring to light what you brought to light in this argument. Then there's the flip side of it, and I'd like for you to speak on that: the ability to actually be engaged in even I guess I hate the word entrepreneurship, but the ability to do more than just live and survive. Because with most people, they take whatever job they can get. They take the first job they can get because they have to pay their bills. And then, of course, all of their unmet potential and talent and their abilities are all instantly stifled because they have to work 40, 50, 60 hours a week doing this. What do you view, or how do you compare the ability, the freedom is actually the word I'm looking for, the freedom that people living off of capital gains get to explore, their labor, their options versus the inability of your average worker to do so?
Yeah, there actually are studies about young entrepreneurs and what makes someone a young entrepreneur, as opposed to just going into the labor force and getting a job. And the big thing is that your family is well off and can kind of support you in the lean years,
Hmm.
because the nature of starting a business is you kind of start off and you don't really make anything for maybe years,
Right.
and you kind of gotta rough it until you can get positive cash flow. And that's not possible to do unless you have an endowment of some sort going in that you can eat off of in the meantime.
Hmm.
And interestingly, in Finland, they did polling on this, and that was one of the things that people said they thought would happen, was that there would be an increase in entrepreneurialism, because this would be like a little basic salary that you
Right.
could pay yourself while you're building your startup business. One example of this in the U.S. is Elon Musk, who
Hmm.
is very widely celebrated and that kind of thing. After he sold his first business, he could have quit and he could have done anything and just
Right.
lived like unimaginably wealthy just on returns. But instead, even though he had all this money, he just decided, I need to make batteries and electric cars, and we
Right.
got to try to, fix the future of energy and that kind of thing. And this really just a hobby project for him. He doesn't need it. The money means nothing to him. It just has enabled him to do that.
Right. And I love this conversation because it really shines a light on the hypocrisy, because everybody who has ever tried to start any business, and most Americans do try, right? Even the poorest among us, we try to get our business going with nani juice and all these other type of schemes to try to, we're all entrepreneurs, but only a small percentage of us actually have access to capital. But it shines a light on hypocrisy because even if we believed this, right? Even if we believe that giving people money makes them lazy, at the same time, we experience it and we see it every day that there has to be a certain level of living met for every single entrepreneur, every single business that's ever started. You start in the hole, but we don't lend that amount of legitimacy to working people. And so what are the hurdles, right? Besides the obvious political spin, besides the desire to not see a socialist America, what are some of the hurdles that you have run into, or that you see as a result of the article that you've written to this universal basic income? And one thing in particular I'm looking for, have you had pushback from people who don't get a dime off of capital gains? Like, have you had pushback from the working class?
No, I don't think so. I mean, people who respond on Twitter and in comments don't necessarily tell you where they're coming from. A lot of the clicks have come from tech. Tech is really interested in UBI right now. And so, a lot of the pushback is if you go onto the Medium post and read the comments, he's like, I started this startup and I, don't like you saying that my living off capital income is, mooching and blah, blah, blah. Like, so there's some of that, but that's not really working class. And one of the things I tried to emphasize in the piece is, one of the things people bring up is you're going to have resentment because, it's going to be the case that there's going to be at least some people who don't work. Right? I mean, it's 300 million people in the country. There's just going to be some. And there's going to be resentment of those people because here I am going to work and you're taxing me to pay this guy who doesn't do anything.
Right.
That's really been, I think, the big issue. So that's why I try to focus on, well, no, we can get this capital income, not income paid to workers, but income paid to owners, and we can grab that. And then we can use that to pay everybody. So then ideally is if you can communicate this to people, they don't think that, their paycheck's going to pay them. They think, oh no, we have this collective pool of assets in society that's going to pay everyone. So that I think is connecting it to the idea of having a sovereign wealth fund where the government owns a bunch of assets and that brings in passive income. Connecting it to that, I think is really crucial to avoid a lot of those problems.
And actually you indirectly hit on exactly what I was hinting at, because one of the things I run into a lot are people who are working 9 to 5, right? And they make, whatever they make, but I see a lot of people who have that resentment towards anyone who takes anything from the government. And that resentment actually is a tool. They undermine their own interests, right? We see this with Obamacare. We see this with Medicare, Medicaid. We see this with anyone who takes a dime from the government. They have this level of disdain for people who do takes, or they are looked down upon by people who go to work and feel like their taxpayer dollars are funding their laziness, and inadvertently they undermine their own best interest because they're not too far from being as poor as the next guy. But that resentment is such a powerful thing. I see it all of the time. What I want to ask you now, though, is what are those practical steps? How do we get from where we are today to that collective pool, that collective set of assets or pool of capital that the government will have? What are those key steps?
To me, the first thing you want to do is just create the fund. You'll have an agency that runs the fund. The federal government has a pension plan for its employees called the Thrift Savings Plan. It's like a 401k, and there's an agency that runs it. And it's basically a wealth fund, but it's only for federal employees for their like 401ks and that kind of thing. And an agency runs it and it's invested and there's hundreds of billions of dollars of assets in it. So we kind of already have a structure in place that does this, that manages big pools of money for the federal government. And you would just create a fund and then you just got to start filling it. And so how do you fill it? Well, you can have a wealth tax where you tax maybe 1% of the net worth of people who own more than $100,000 of assets or something. You could have in my piece I call counter-cyclical asset purchases. This is something that actually some very like centrist economists have said is a good idea, and that is that when the economy tanks, the federal government should just print money and buy up a lot of equity at really low prices.
Right.
So like in 2008, the stock market just collapsed, and the federal government could have printed $1 trillion and bought tons of stocks, S&P, Dow Jones, whatever. And then that stuff comes back. It's already returned back to where it was a few years later. Right. And that's just a huge amount of money that it could have just, grabbed. So stuff like that, just little tricks to kind of get it going, get it building.
Right. So conceptually, right, you're changing the way we perceive the federal government, right? So the infrastructure is already there, but we never really look at the government as an investor. Not in the collective, not the body politic, right? We want to see the government as a nonprofit or some type of some other type of entity, but not a structure that invests, or not an entity that invests. This sounds like, in a way, the flip side of this sounds like it would be a huge giveaway to Wall Street. I mean, to the investment community. I mean, this would be billions, if not trillions of dollars of assets that would be invested into our capitalistic system. Why wouldn't they be head over heels excited about this?
Well, it would be work for Wall Street. So Wall Street banks, one way you would probably do this, and this is how they do it with the thrift savings plan, is you hire Wall Street firms to manage the money, you contract it out. And so that would be work for them to get those contracts. But at the same time, the way that you're filling up the fund is basically taxing money from very wealthy people. Right. So they get more work at their business, but they're also losing money out of their personal wealth funds as that stuff gets moved into the collective fund. So I actually don't know what a Wall Street, what their perspective would be if you could actually pitch this thing in earnest. No one really proposes it in like real politics, so maybe they would be okay with it. I don't really know.
I mean, I'm just thinking, right? Because I'm not, I got my undergrad in economics, so I'm by no means an expert to be able to analyze this. But just thinking about what you've said so far, if it's going to cost them about 1% of their incomes over $100,000, I say you bump that up to $250. But anyway, if it's going to be 1% of their incomes, but in turn, right? I mean, of course, not everyone is going to be the person who's doing the transaction, or even the people who are going to yield the benefits. But some people are going to get some windfalls from this, right? There are going to be some key players, some key investment houses and key funds that are going to get a windfall from this type of investment from the federal government. It sounds like it would be a win-win if I lose 1% here, but I'm making an extra 3 or 4 million this year because of my activities. Why wouldn't, or am I seeing it conceptually wrong?
Well, it's the 1% that I have in mind is 1% on wealth, so not income. So if you had, $1 million in assets, you would be paying over, $10,000 a year just in the wealth tax, and it would go year after year after year. It would kind of slowly drain you. You could probably outrun that if you got enough income coming in and be a net winner. But
so you're not looking for a one-time 1%. You're looking for an annual 1%.
Yeah, every year, just gradually build it up that way. Because paying in 1% of your net worth each year doesn't hurt that much. But after 20 years, the federal government now owns 20% of the wealth.
Yeah, and if they have nothing to beat that momentum, then the government really has taken all of their wealth at the end of 100 years or whatever. But okay, so no, that from that perspective, if it's if it's not a one-time investment, then I can see why people would just be probably completely against this. But you never know, right? You have to see. It might benefit some people more than others. I think
it definitely would benefit most people, right? Because wealth is very concentrated, way more concentrated than income. Like the top 10% of people own like 90% of the financial wealth in the country. So that's really who would take the hit.
Right.
Other people wouldn't. And you could also, like I said, put a kind of progressive bracket structure where you're like, your first $100,000 of wealth that you own, that's not going to be taxed. You can just hold that and you're fine. And most people don't own more than $100,000 of wealth, so that would really just cut off the top 5% or something and just sort of drain them.
Yeah, that's if we, it's that very small group and their ability to convince the rest of us that something like this would not be in our best interest, even though something like this would be in the best interest of the 99 or probably 99.9%. But the power that top 0.1% has to shape political discourse and opinions, it's almost like we would have to do something that benefits them if it's going to ever stand a chance of benefiting the rest of us. So that's why I posed the question. But I think you've really kind of nailed that dilemma that we would run into and the potential of UBI. I think it just changes. It really flips the conversation on the head, Matt. And that's why I wanted to bring you on the show, because not many people are thinking like this presently, and very publicly, and with the platform of your significance, and a lot of people like to listen to you. Where do we go from here? How do we even make what's the very next step to actually seeing something like this happen? Because as you mentioned in some of your other interviews, there is a drastic change coming to our economy where a lot of blue collar working jobs, are going to be completely replaced by automation soon. So this is a conversation that we're going to be forced to have sooner rather than later. What is our first step to getting there before we get in crisis mode?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not really a political organizing genius, unfortunately. So you can join organizations, I guess, that might be interested in it. Obviously, it's not going to happen under Trump, so you'll have to wait until at least 4 years to see if you could get something better going. But yeah, I don't really know how to organize people to make it happen. Unfortunately, that's for other people.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's not a bad thing. I mean, we weren't. I don't think any of us were going to sit around and think of how to get this done, and you did that part for us. So we'll throw this out into the water for everyone else to see, like, this is something that can actually happen. Here's a framework. Here's something that we could build upon. So we'll take that, and I'll charge that with my audience and everyone else that's listening to you. We'll take that responsibility. Matt, tell everybody how to get up with you and where they can read some more of your stuff.
Yeah, just follow me on Twitter at Matt Bruenig, MattBruenig.
Thanks so much for joining me, Matt. It's always a pleasure, man. Take care.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome.